Dr. Rashawn Ray, welcome to Planet America.
Thank you for having me.
So, explain to us about critical race theory, where it's come from and what's in it.
So critical race theory is a theoretical framework that emerged decades ago, primarily by legal scholars, but has also been taken up by social scientists. And it has one kind of simple premise, and that is the fact that racism isn't simply housed in individuals, but it's actually housed in our social institutions, in our education system, in our criminal justice system, in the labor market, in housing. And part of thinking about that is that we must be critical in our approach to extend beyond the simple individual explanation of racism and instead look at how racism is baked into our policies, our rules, our procedures, and our laws that then disparately impact people in society.
Okay, now that doesn't sound super scary, but a lot of people are confused about this. So I'm going to read you some quotes from an anti-CRT law that was passed in Oklahoma, that's currently being challenged in court by the ACLU. And I'd just like you to tell me, does critical race theory teach any of these things? That one race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex. That an individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist, sexist, or oppressive. That an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his or her race or sex. That any individual should feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. Are any of those concepts critical race theory?
No, not necessarily. So what's important for people to recognize is that because individuals can't oftentimes make sense of the way that racism operates through social institutions, they default back down to the individual level. And at times they can internalize that. And now whether or not people hearing about the history of racism in America makes people sad, makes people feel like that they should be doing something about it, well, we think that's important, but we definitely don't want to necessarily view it as someone getting blamed for it. Now, in a piece that I wrote at the Brookings Institution with Alex Gibbons, we laid out all of these states, and Oklahoma is one of those interesting ones where, similar to other states, they never explicitly mention critical race theory. Critical race theory has become what we call a boogeyman and a catch-all for everything related to racism. And it's the primary point that oftentimes individuals cannot separate their individual identities from the United States as a nation state. And the other thing is also some people are not willing to admit the role that racism plays not only in the lives of other people, but even in their own lives in terms of structuring not just economic opportunities, but also social and cultural opportunities that the United States needs to try to get past.
And Dr. Ray, how would you sum up the way that critical race theory is viewed when projected through the lens of Fox News to parents who understand it to be, my kids are going to school and being told that we're all a bunch of racists?
Yeah, well, we know in a very short period of time, over the past several months, Fox News, at the time we published our article, had used critical race theory about 1,300 times. I mean, they were using it multiple times a day. And when we actually did the analysis, what we found was that critical race theory was used as a proxy for anything that related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And critical race theory wasn't solely focused on race and racism. It also extended to talking about gender, to talking about sexual orientation, to talking about other forms of difference. We know that there have been a series of what we call dog whistles, these kind of silent alarms that go off, particularly to white families, as you mentioned in the suburbs, particularly to mothers, where we know that overwhelmingly white women were much more likely to vote Republican in Virginia than Democrat. And part of what has happened is that critical race theory has become this catch-all for everything. And because of that, it is blamed very similarly to the way that defund the police is being framed as being anything related to wanting to make changes to law enforcement. What people have to recognize about the US context is that conservatives and Republicans are much better at messaging than liberals and Democrats. And because of that, oftentimes they control the narrative, even if that narrative is not entirely correct or even remotely correct. It doesn't matter if they can drive that narrative. And that's part of what we saw in Virginia. And I think we've also seen that in some other places as well.
Doctor, how has it changed your day-to-day studying of critical race theory since it became a political label? Has that become an impediment?
No, not at all. See, this is what's so interesting. There was a poll on Twitter by Dr. Whitney Pirtle, who is a professor at University of California at Merced. She sent out a poll recently and said, to all sociologists, were you taught critical race theory during your PhD studies? And a large percentage, or well over 50%, said no. So what's interesting about this is that it's actually a small percentage of us who have actually been exposed to it. Critical race theory was one of many theoretical frameworks that I was exposed to across the board. It wasn't really exposed to it in a direct class. It came from an independent study with a professor. The point is that it's being overblown, not just in terms of the way people learn, but also in terms of the way they teach. I currently teach a race relations course at the undergraduate level at the University of Maryland. It's 120 students in the class. And the primary reason why we talked about critical race theory is because of the broader focus in the media. It's barely even something that I mention in class. And if I do, I mention it within the context of several other theories. So part of what's happened is that this backlash to diversity and inclusion, this backlash to progress, and this is what's key for people, is that whenever progress is being pursued, there are people who will fight tooth and nail to preserve that inequality. That's part of what's happening now. They're trying to latch onto it. Critical race theory has simply become the new wrapper that includes something inside that is trying to prevent progress. So when I'm teaching my race class, barely do I even bring it up. Instead, I have more students asking me about it. We actually had an event on critical race theory because so many students were asking me about it. And it's not something that I typically cover in depth. And that's part of the backlash. You now have high schoolers emailing me, high school teachers emailing me saying, do you have information? And of course, I think we've written one of the signature articles to help people make sense of this. We also have a digest of all of the states and what they're doing that we update on the Brookings website. And part of that backlash is the result of people on the right inflaming critical race theory and less of people on the left actually wanting to use it as a tool.
So if critical race theory has become this proxy, a little bit like political correctness or affirmative action was back in the 1990s, what, though, does the way in which the media and politics are handling this debate say about critical race theory? Or what indeed does critical race theory say about those institutions?
Yeah, most definitely. I mean, look, when we look in the U.S. context, there have been very few U.S. senators, and we know only one Black identifying president who's biracial, and then also one Black vice president who's also biracial in Kamala Harris. So part of thinking about this backlash is we know in the political sphere, it is one of the social institutions that's deeply embedded and entrenched in how we talk about these particular issues. And again, I think there's one big thing that this tells me. It tells me that progress is being made. And again, there are some people who are trying to prevent that progress from happening because deep down, they firmly know and understand that they might actually benefit from some earned assets that might not only be economic in nature, but social and cultural in terms of how they experience life. And similar to the people that stormed the US Capitol on January 6th, where, mind you, some of that backlash is that some of those people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th got elected this week in the United States. So that should tell people where we are, that there are people fighting tooth and nail to preserve that inequality, because there are some people who believe the United States of America was founded for them and people who look like them, and not for everyone to be included, which is what I think a lot of people want, regardless of race, including a lot of white people, want us to get past racism, want us to move forward as a nation. But there are definitely people, including some people in those people's own families, who want to prevent that from happening. And so it tells me that progress is being made, and we are on the brink of a huge form of progress, similar to what happened in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Movement, similar to what happened a century before that in 1865 when the Civil War ended. We are on the brink of something big. It just has to keep being pushed as it's being resisted.
So how do you reach people who only hear what you have to say, mediated through the prism of Tucker Carlson? Or is there no point even trying to reach them?
Well, look, one thing we know is that cable news viewership and social media is highly polarized. Some of it is actually related to algorithms and the way that they're sorted. A few years ago, I conducted a study with some colleagues looking at a year in the life of Ferguson. Of course, people pretty much point to Ferguson as being the catalyst that created the Black Lives Matter movement in Missouri, where Michael Brown was killed. And part of thinking about that is we found that people might be talking about police brutality, They might be talking about Black Lives Matter, but they are rarely having those conversations with one another. In fact, we examined over 30 million tweets. And of those tweets, we found that less than 0.1% were people in these different echo chambers across the board actually having similar conversations with each other. We found something similar in regards to our recent study on cyberbullying and racism on Twitter and Reddit. So part of thinking about that is I think we have to change the way that algorithms operate, because algorithms on social media are simply set up to reflect back to us what the algorithm thinks we want to see. So it simply drives people farther and farther apart, which oftentimes isn't the truth and isn't good on the left or the right. Instead, there is some place in the middle where people can get more objective information. And I think we have to think about how that comes to fruition. And part of trying to reach people who have been more polarized is that the same way they've been polarized, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can put together search and strategies that can help people get more objective information in schools, also on social media, to at least have a baseline. To even if you're not on the same page, you can at least be in the same book. Right now, people aren't even in the same book. They're not even reading from the same library. And I think that's problematic for thinking about how to move forward.
Dr. Ray, do you understand the concerns of parents who worry that all these people are making decisions about what their children should be taught, and they maybe don't trust the process? Are there enough checks and balances to make sure that whether it's on the subject of race or science or anything else, that this is actually a balanced approach?
Most definitely. I mean, I'm a parent, and I think most parents overwhelmingly, regardless of their race, their social class background, their age, want what's best for their children. I want what's best for my children. But you know what? I also want what's best for all children. And I think that's part of the problem, is that some people want what's best for their kids and aren't necessarily worried about others. But there is a broader systemic problem at play. And that's the fact that in the United States, school funding is primarily driven by property taxes. So what's happened over the past 20 years, 25 years or so, and it's simply worsened, that social class, particularly income inequality in the United States, has increased, and property value inequality has increased. So schools are vastly different. So sometimes you could have a parent saying that something is happening where they are that's problematic, and it might not be happening somewhere else. That's a problem. In the United States, the federal government promises people and promises children an equal education. That is not happening, not just in terms of resources, but also in terms of information and content. And those are the sort of things that need to change. When you're going to school in the United States, you should be getting similar information. Yeah, sure, maybe it's something specific about your state or your city, but overwhelmingly, people should be getting similar information. If you're in California compared to being in New York, Texas, Georgia, or Tennessee, you're oftentimes getting different information, and it spills over into voting, it spills over into people's attitudes, and it spills over into how people think about progress and upward mobility in the United States.
Rashawn Ray, thank you very much indeed for being on Planet America.
Thank you for having me.